Welcome. The second pathway we'll look at is the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway, a sensory pathway. This pathway is responsible for conscious proprioception, that is the knowledge of where different parts of your body are relative to one another, position in space, two-point discrimination, that is fine touch, and vibratory sense. The peripheral receptors for these modalities are muscle spindles, seen here, for proprioception, cutaneous Meissner's cells for touch, Pacinian corpuscles for deep pressure and vibration, and Golgi tendon organs for tension on the tendons. The pathway that we'll be looking at is a 3-neuron ascending chain. It has a centrally oriented process starting out in the dorsal root ganglion that sends large myelinated fibers into the spinal cord. Its peripheral process is a receptor in the distal extremities or in other parts of the body. These primary fibers ascend within the spinal cord to the spinomedullary junction, where they synapse ipsilaterally with the second-order cell. The axons of these second-order neurons decussate, that is, they cross the midline at the spinomedullary junction. These axons ascend through the brainstem in the medial lemniscus, a medially located pathway. And the second-order cells synapse on third-order neurons in the thalamus, the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, or VPL, of the thalamus. These third-order neurons, the thalamocortical neurons, project through the internal capsule up to the postcentral gyrus, primary somatosensory cortex. We see here the fibers coming in the dorsal root, cell bodies in the dorsal root ganglion, and they will occupy a position, if they are coming from the leg, in the fasciculus gracilis that we see on this medial position, and they will stay on the side they come in. And if they're coming in from the arm, they'll come in and enter at the thoracic or cervical level and take a position in the fasciculus cuneatus, seen here in a darker blue. And you'll stay ipsilateral within the spinal cord. They will then travel up to the spinomedullary junction, where they will synapse ipsilaterally on second-order neurons, nucleus gracilis for the legs, nucleus cuneatus for the arms. We can see the overall pathway for these fibers starting out in the periphery, and for the legs starting out at coming in at the lumbar level of the cord, and then traveling in the fasciculus gracilis, we see here in blue, right up until they get to the spinomedullary junction, where they will synapse on second-order neurons that will cross over to the other side, form the medial lemniscus, and travel up in the medial lemniscus through the brainstem, initially starting very medially and gradually moving more laterally to the point where the leg fibers are said to kick out more laterally as they get up to the pons and the midbrain, and then travel on to the thalamus, to the VPL, ventral posterior lateral nucleus of the thalamus, and from the thalamus travel up to the cortex. We see here that with these long fibers that might extend all the way from the lumbar cord all the way up to the cortex, they are supplied at different portions of that pathway by different vascular territories. So that in the spinal cord, they are fed by the posterior spinal artery that we see located here just next to the dorsal root coming into the spinal cord and feeding the dorsal columns. As fibers get up to the brainstem, they are fed by a different territory, and that is by the anterior spinal artery. And the anterior spinal artery is located right near the ventral medulla, and we see that anterior spinal artery feeding the medial lemniscus as well as the pyramid on the same side. pyramid, of course, carrying motor fibers. We see here the location at many levels of that pathway from the spinal cord up through the brainstem and all the way up to the cortex. And we're going to look at that at different levels in some detail. And we can see, of course, that the legs are coming in from lumbar levels, traveling up in fasciculus gracilis, and the arms carrying information about muscle spindles, Golgi tendon organs, and Meissner's cells coming in the dorsal root into the fasciculus cuneatus, traveling up to the spinomedullary junction, where they will have a synapse at the dorsal column nuclei, and then the second order neuron will decussate at the spinomedullary junction, stay medially in the medulla, and then travel a little more laterally as they gradually go up through the brainstem until they reach ventral posterior lateral nucleus, and then from there travel through the third order neuron through the internal capsule, an axon pathway, up to the postcentral gyrus. On the opposite, this is all on the opposite hemisphere from the origin, and in areas known as 3, 1, and 2, Brodmann areas 3, 1, and 2. And we can see that represented here as the fibers came up from the spinal cord synapse and then send the second order neurons to the other side in the medial lemniscus up to the thalamus, and then travel to the point where they're located at the cortex. And we'll look at that in some detail at each level. So if we look first at the spinal cord level, we can see the fibers coming in. The leg fibers had come in from T6 and below. The arm fibers above that level coming in the dorsal root to occupy the fasciculus gracilis and fasciculus cuneatus. As we move a little bit higher, we get up to the spinomedullary junction, the caudal medulla, and we see now that the fibers occupy this position, the nucleus gracilis, where they synapse, and the nucleus cuneatus for the arms. And the fibers travel over to the other side. They decussate to occupy the medial lemniscus, with the arms just above the legs. And both of these are just above the pyramid, which is carrying motor information from the same limbs. As we get up into the pons, we see that the legs start to move out, and we call the legs kicking out in the medial lemniscus, and the arm is still sitting more medial. This is the basis pontus, carrying a large number of motor fibers right here. As we get up to the lower midbrain, we see that the medial lemniscus has moved further laterally with the leg up here and the arm over a little bit lower. And we see here the decussation fibers for the superior cerebellar peduncle. And we see also the cerebral peduncles here of the midbrain. As we get higher in the midbrain, we see that the medial lemniscus is still lateral, and we see the cerebral peduncles prominently represented, as well as the red nucleus on each side, and the cerebral periaqueductal gray. As we come up to the thalamus, we see that the second order neuron synapse here at the thalamus, and those fibers that are going to go for that represent the leg will be coming up to a medial position in the paracentral lobule. And those representing the trunk as well as the arms will be more lateral, and those representing the head will be most lateral. And they will all synapse on neurons in all of these regions in the postcentral gyrus, in areas that carry information that is spread out in what we refer to as a topographic map or a somatotopic map. The head most lateral, the arms more medial, and the legs most medial. That's the postcentral gyrus, and those locations are immediately adjacent to the precentral gyrus, which has information about motor neurons. Recognize that coming from the ventral posterior lateral nucleus, fibers have to travel through the internal capsule in order to get to the cerebral cortex. Recognize that if we're looking at the left cortex, it represents the right side of the head and body. Damage to the dorsal column pathway depends on where it takes place. Its effect on dorsal column lesions are a loss of vibration sensation, 2-point discrimination, that is fine touch, as well as position, conscious proprioception, where different parts of a body are in space. Spinal cord lesions produce ipsilateral effects to the location of the limb of the lesion at all segments at or below the affected level. So if you have damage at T6, then at the thoracic level and everything below, you might have a loss of those sensations that we've referred to. That's defined as a sensory level, when it's not just a loss of sensation at that location, but at all locations below that level. We can see that because of the crossover, there is a different effect of damage above the spinal cord, and lesions to the dorsal column medial lemniscal pathway above the spinal cord are contralateral, and we'll look at those. And it is a loss of all of these sensations that we referred to. And the affected side of the body, both in the brainstem and the thalamus and in the cortex, is contralateral and below the lesion, whereas in the spinal cord, represented here by the D, all of the effects are ipsilateral and below the lesion. This is very important to recognize. It depends on which level of the fasciculus gracilis and cuneatus is affected to determine whether the arms or the legs will be affected. A lesion in the mid-thoracic level of the cord tends to spare fibers of the arm because they enter above that level. A lesion at T10 results in a sensory loss roughly at the umbilicus. It's a good marker. And so if you have a loss of sensation at the umbilicus or below, you know you're roughly at T10. And it would extend all the way down to the legs, not affecting the arms. Small lesions that affected a portion of the pathway, and that tends to happen particularly in myelinating lesions, may affect fasciculus gracilis or fasciculus cuneatus in an isolation affecting either the arm or the leg, but not necessarily both. And as we indicated, lesions above the spinomedullary junction, that is in the medial lemniscus or higher in the thalamus, internal capsule, or postcentral gyrus, all produce contralateral loss of vibration, 2-point discrimination, proprioception, because the fibers have crossed at this medial lemniscus location in the choroid medulla. Thus, you might be asked to differentiate the effects of damage at A, here in the spinal cord, in this case in the fasciculus gracilis, from those at B. And of course, what we would expect is that you'd have an ipsilateral sensory loss in the leg at A, if there were damage at A, and damage at B would produce a contralateral sensory loss in the leg. If the damage were more lateral, it might produce a contralateral sensory loss in the arm or in the face. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to ask me. Thank you.